wonderful ideas and suggestions for guests and topics.
Great events, programs, and student activities.
All the countries are using
Welcome to this week's Seminar Dialogue Houston. I'm your host, Lawrence Payne. To our regular viewing audience, welcome. To those joining us for the first time here for ACC's TV Dialogue Houston, we can be found every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 a.m., again at 6 p.m., and on Saturday afternoons at 3 p.m. As always, at the top of the hour, let me thank you for your thoughtful emails, text messages, and phone calls concerning previous shows we've aired on ACC's TV Dialogue Houston, and particularly your great ideas for guests and subjects to be covered on upcoming segments of Dialogue Houston. For after all, this is your community affairs, public affairs show now proudly in its 30th season. Have a great show lined up for you this afternoon. I want to expose you to an organization that maybe some of you may have heard of, maybe not, most are probably not, to talk about the great work it's doing for its own community, but also for the community at large here in Houston, and that is our Muslim community. And I really am proud to have none other than Shariq Abdul Ghani, who is Executive Director of the Minaret Foundation, a nonpartisan, non-sectarian group who does advocacy work on many issues, which you'll be talking about. But I could go on and on because I've been brought up to speed on all the great work they do, but I'm gonna let Shariq instead do that. So let me just stop there and say welcome. So glad to have you join us.
Thank you, Larry. Appreciate the time and the exposure, and also the opportunity to have a conversation with you today.
How old is the foundation?
Foundation's going on 12 years now.
Okay, so tell us the work that we do through the foundation.
Well, at Minaret Foundation, we bring Muslims, Jews, and Christians together. Think barbecue, dodgeball, and discussion. And then we answer that age-old question of, well, we've held hands, we've sung Kumbaya, what do we do next? And for us, that next step is leveraging our faith traditions to change the world around us, and specifically in the areas of policy for food insecurity, child welfare, and religious freedom.
You know, when you have an organization that brings together Christian, Muslims, and Jews, it is a possibility to have a great discussion and to work on all the issues, right? From food insecurity to affordable housing, to health problems, to social isolation, to low wages, to minimum care costs for it. You get to bring that whole faith communities, those three faith traditions and communities together to really be advocates for all of these needs. It's such a great idea.
And there's such strong intersectionality between our faith communities and these three issues. I mean, Moses, Jesus, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, all three of them cared very heavily about issues related to hunger and poverty. All of them cared about child welfare. They all cared about the needs of our children and the foundation that they serve. And all of them were either persecuted at some point because of their religion. So religious freedom is really treads all three of our communities very heavily.
You know, we don't think about that a lot, do we? About the three faith traditions and the threads that run so deeply between the three of them. I'm always, always amazed from a, pardon me, from an ethical, moral perspective, how we don't raise up the common bonds we have around these issues from an ethical, moral perspective of each one of our traditions. And to begin to say, look, we know that to get to equity, it passes through ethics first, secondly to empathy, and third to equity. And unless we can get this understanding from an ethics perspective, that all human beings' lives matter, all human beings are equal. First, the ethical thing. The second, the empathy, that we come together to share our stories, to talk about our experiences, to learn and teach each other about where we've come through, walking down that trail together. And then third, out of all of that, hopefully equity comes. And I think the work that you do really exemplifies all three of those, but perhaps as we go forward, maybe we could highlight some of that even more going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way that you put it there. You said ethics, empathy, and then equity. I'm going to steal that, by the way. We'll call it the triple E.
All right.
Or we'll call it the three E's.
But I think it's important because what I've always found out in any dispute, let's just pick one, the age-old Israeli-Palestinian dispute, right?
Sure.
I'm always amazed, and maybe naively so, I will say that because they're talking from a common perspective on the ethical moralness of the human being, that it should be able to have some kind of resolve into realizing that it is necessary to set aside the political piece of this and look at the humanity piece of this and come to some resolve. Whether it's going to be a one-state solution, which I don't think is going to work, more like a two-state solution where each state has its own sovereignty, and we recognize the humanity and sovereignty of each state. But it ought to be a way to elevate that conversation to a higher level, given whom they are, where they are, the region of the world that they're in. And there's such deep faith traditions that talk about the sanctity and dignity of human beings and humanity. Maybe am I missing something there?
Well, I mean, well, it goes back to your three E's, right? So
Right.
I think when we're showing empathy about the situation itself in Israel and Palestine, we were on a call the other morning about this very issue.
Yeah.
We have to see the historical nature of what's going on, and then some of the atrocities and the crimes committed. That's something that's very integral, and their story has become a part of their moral fabric. But an issue becomes when we frame this in the lens of religiosity. So if we call this a Muslim versus Jewish conflict, it's a big problem. One, because we erase the Christians, right?
Right,
Jesus was
right.
Palestinian. He was a Palestinian Jew, wasn't he?
Right.
And so we eliminate the whole Christian aspect of it. And that's a big complaint of the Christian community, because there is a significant population of Christian Palestinians who are oppressed and live in the same conditions that the Palestinian Muslims do. We just have to think about Bethlehem, Jericho. They're both in the West Bank. Right? So it's a deeply complicated issue. But if we're going to be empathetic about it, it's definitely more than just the humanity of it. Because I think both sides want the best lives for their children and their grandchildren and their great grandchildren, but they also want to live in freedom.
Yeah. It is complicated. I'm not going to try to get any more into that.
No.
Because
we could spend the next 5 hours talking about it.
We could. So let's pivot back to this country, U.S. and to Houston. Talk to me a moment about the food insecurity thing, because people don't realize. I'm always amazed when I say food insecurity, and then I use the next phrase, food desert. People look at you like, food insecurity and food deserts in Houston? That can't be. And the number is staggering, is it not?
Numbers are terrible. We're talking about Israel, Palestine. We have to recenter our conversations as people of faith to what's happening right here in Houston. I remember when everything was happening with Flint, Michigan and the water issue, it was, do you understand what's happening here in Houston? We're talking about, we're getting distracted by Flint, which is a very real issue, but we've got to keep focused on what's happening in our own backyard, where we can effectively make some form of change. 1 in 4 children in Houston are food insecure. So what does food insecurity even mean? Food insecurity isn't about hunger, it's about access. It's having access to the right nutrition, access to food, access to sustainable meals. So when we think about food insecurity, let's instead think of 1 in 4 children in Harris County, not Somalia, not Myanmar, not some other foreign nation. 1 in 4 children in Houston are food insecure. 500,000 Houstonians live in food deserts, right? 500,000 Houstonians live in food deserts. Again, I'm not talking about a third world or a developing nation. I'm talking about right here in the greater Houston area. Hunger is a massive issue. And I'll put it in a way that many of your viewers can understand. If parents don't have the money for food, and they have just enough money for just a small meal, they'll resort to McDonald's fast food, or they'll purchase the same fast food day in and day out. Children will go to school having Doritos and a Diet Coke for breakfast. If children don't have the necessary nutrition to succeed, they'll display poor educational and behavioral outcomes in school. It becomes a cycle. Becomes a revolving door, a big problem within our community. And we're seeing the effects of it today, whether it be an HISD or an A-Leaf ISD, even in Spring Branch ISD, the negative effects of children not having enough food. We saw it during COVID, right? When the schools are closed, a big part of the reason to get the schools to reopen during COVID was because the only source of proper nutrition that children could have for breakfast and lunch was the school system itself, because many families don't have the money to feed their children.
Yeah, that was their only meal and source of food for breakfast and lunch.
That's right.
And so what happens, and people always say, well, look, we have the Houston Food Bank, the largest food bank in the country. And how can you still have food insecurity and food desert? Because it still cannot fill that gap. There is still a gap there that needs to be filled. And I think you hit it so hard, the actual lack of nutrition for young people trying to get education. We know that from the testing that we used to do with STAR testing and other tests. We had to make sure that the student had breakfast first. You're going to go in and take a test on empty stomach. Not only empty stomach from no breakfast, you didn't have dinner the night before either.
That's right.
So now you expect to come in and do well on this test when you haven't had anything to eat since yesterday for lunch at school. So we had to fill that gap really quickly and get everybody in line with that. So what do you see going forward that can be done? You've been now appointed to a great task force. You're actually wearing another hat.
Right.
So you can
I'm the chairman of the Food Insecurity Board.
Right, chairman of the Food Insecurity Board, City of Houston Mayor's Office. So tell us about the work of that wonderful board.
Well, our board, composed of 19 members throughout the greater Houston area, we're tasked with identifying solutions to tackle the issue of food insecurity in Houston. And so I've given board members a specific charge. So we're supposed to identify policies that are, one, low-hanging fruit, two, they have to be bipartisan, and three, they shouldn't cost much money. Meaning, we already know how to tackle food insecurity in Houston. We have a good sense of how we can approach it. The policies already exist, whether they're in Houston, in Harris County, in Fort Bend County, in San Francisco, in Chicago, in New York, or in Tallahassee. The policies already exist. It's a matter of finding what works in other regions throughout the country or throughout a state, and then piloting them and implementing them here in Houston. Right. And this could be in terms of food deserts. It could be in terms of food access. It could be in terms of food waste, food recycling, even growing your own food. Because food insecurity is going to take a multimodal approach. It's not a one size fits all. Right. We're not going to be able to eradicate food insecurity in the next year, in the next 5 years. It's going to take a deliberate whole of a community effort. That means our faith leaders, our community leaders, our neighbors, our bus drivers, our janitors, our physicians, everyone has to come and become involved in the story of hunger in Houston in order for us to tackle it properly.
And some local partners are really working hard. Some of the grocery store chains are really stepped up to the plate to try to fill in some of those food desert gaps by having mobile grocery stores, have they not?
Yeah, so we've seen partners come up in terms of grocery stores and mobile grocery stores who come out to food deserts and provide people with access. We have a great nonprofit that's about to get started. It's called the Little Red Box Grocery Store. It's starting up in Second Ward in Councilmember Gallegos' district, which is a nonprofit grocery store. It's an entirely different model. You see, in these areas that are called food deserts, a food desert is essentially an area that doesn't have a grocery store or a major supply of nutrition, right? They have convenience stores, they have liquor stores, but they're not selling lettuce. They're not selling, oatmeal. They're not selling good nutritional foods. It's your donuts, it's your hot dogs, it's your quesadillas. But that's really the range of it. It's that type of food, right? It's a little much lower than fast food, unfortunately. Right. And that's the most prevalent amount of food in some of the food deserts in Houston. So we have a gap in terms of we need grocery stores. And the H-E-Bs and the Krogers of the world will not go into these areas because it doesn't make economic sense for them.
Not enough rooftops, not enough people.
There's not enough rooftops. And for your viewers, rooftops are just households. Right? There's not enough households because you don't cross the freeway to go to a grocery store. You go to the grocery store that's within 5 to 6 minutes from you. Right. And so there's not enough households in these food desert areas to justify a mega grocery store from opening up.
The distinction there, when we talk about household, we mean homeowners as opposed to
homeowners.
Renters.
Yes. Sorry. Homeowners.
There are a bunch of renters, but renters, that's not what they count. They're looking for homeowners.
They don't count renters. That's right. Homeowners is what they count.
It becomes very challenging to fill in those gaps. One of the things I think that's interesting about this whole food desert thing is that when you look at the convenience stores who actually try to sell produce, if you really judge the quality of that produce, most of the time it's not anything you want to eat. I'm not sure if it's sometimes fit to serve to some animals, but that's all that's left. That's all that's left. And I think it's so sad that the prices they charge for inferior product to start with is so outrageous. But when that's all you have, and that's all you have available to you, the only thing you have access to from transportation wise is to get to that corner convenience store. It really then exacerbates the issue, because then there's health challenges sometimes with that produce. So you just kind of keep on the spiral effect. Just keeps on building and building and building.
Well, if people are working 2 or 3 part-time jobs just to make ends meet, they don't have time to catch 2 or 3 buses to get to the nearest HEB or Kroger's. It's just not going to happen. And then they have to spend time with their children. Well, they want to spend time with their children. They need to help their children with their homework. They have home maintenance duties. They have spousal duties. They've got taking care of their elderly family members. There's so much that goes into it. So unfortunately, that convenience store becomes a Band-Aid, but it almost becomes a permanent fix for them for their near future. And food deserts aren't the only issue when it comes to food insecurity. I'll give you an example. Just this last year, $182 million went unused in SNAP benefits. There's a significant chunk of our city that qualifies for SNAP EBT benefits, meaning free food, right, at the grocery store, to be used to buy the vegetables, to be able to buy the macaroni and cheese, to be able to buy apple juice and orange juice and milk. $182 million went unused. And why is this? It's not because of a lack of cards. It's because people don't know that they qualify for SNAP, right? And I'll say something very unusual. Under President Trump, he actually made it very easy to qualify for SNAP and EBT benefits. We just aren't taking advantage of SNAP EBT benefits because there's a stigma of taking free money from the government or considering it welfare when it's not. It's just assistance, and everyone needs a helping hand sometimes. And that's another point of commonality between our 3 faiths, between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, is this concept of lending a hand to our neighbors. That everyone of all stripes at some point in time will need a hand. They'll either get that hand from God, they'll get that hand from their companion, from their neighbor, from their family members, but everyone is put in a situation where they need a lending hand. And so in our case, there's 182 million hands that have been given out, but folks just aren't picking it up because they just might not know. There's some stigma around it, or they don't know how to enroll.
So back to the faith traditions of those 3 communities, particularly those churches in those neighborhoods. When I say church, parish, temple, synagogue, or mosque, it could be any one, but mostly in these areas of poverty we're talking about, around food deserts and food insecurity, it tends to be churches. What could those faith communities do to educate their population? I call them the pew people who come on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday worship, who sits in somebody's pew, to educate the pew people as to, as you just said, the funds are here readily available for you. There's money to be had. There's services to be received. And it's falling on deaf ear and not being utilized, and all these great resources. I think sometimes we miss a mark by not engaging the houses of worship to educate their congregations who's sitting there as a captive audience to what the concerns and needs are and how they can help their neighbor, their friend, access these free resources, these monies that are just waiting many times, as you said, to be utilized and sit there many times and go unused for the whole cycle.
That's right. Well, there's really 4 things that our faith leaders can do. The first thing is they could provide nutrition education. There's all sorts of spiritual education. Sometimes there's employment education. We could use our churches, our mosques, and our synagogues as centers of learning as it relates to nutrition education, why we need to eat better, how we can eat better, right? Sometimes people just don't know how to cook. One of the things that the food bank learned early on was that they're giving out canned beans, but people don't have a can opener, giving out microwave meals, but people don't have a microwave. They don't even have a pot, right? So nutrition education along with how to cook in your situation. I think that's number 1. The second thing is serving as a center, as a point for SNAP enrollment, right? just to provide the education, as you mentioned, to their congregation of this is how you qualify for SNAP, this is how you can enroll in SNAP, and this is what you can do with SNAP. Those three items. Most churches have an outreach or a missions director. Most of them have volunteer directors. And if they don't, then it falls just on another duty of the pastor or the imam or the rabbi. But they can provide this level of information about SNAP enrollment. The third is doing food insecurity screenings, right? So whenever someone comes in asking for charity, or someone comes in and they're going through trouble in their life, well, knowing the right questions to ask to know if they're hungry or not, or if they're having the best level of nutrition. There have been so many times in my life where people have come to me, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing, where they have complaints about employment, complaints about housing, complaints about maybe even their marriage, but at the end of it, they also don't have any food because of a lack of employment, because of a lack of a car, because of a lack of a healthy relationship. They're not eating right. They're not getting the right type of nutrition. So having these food insecurity screenings with faith leaders as well. And then the fourth is having food pantries. Having food pantries at the church and the mosque and synagogue with culturally relevant food. I'll give you an example. The Taiwanese church isn't going to stock grits. They might stock noodles. The mosque may not have, I don't know, the mosque may not have Chef Boyardee ravioli. They might just need raw meat and raw beef or masalas and, maybe a can of hummus. I don't know. But we have to have culturally relevant foods in our food pantry. Am I making you hungry?
No, I said hummus works for everybody.
Hummus works for everyone. There you go. But we have to have culturally relevant foods at our pantries. The reason to have a food pantry is more than just being able to provide food to our congregants and to our parish. It's about creating a shift in the mindset, because right now what happens is if a community center or a church has a food pantry, it's usually stocked from the Houston Food Bank, or let's say the Third Ward Food Bank, or the Third Ward Food Pantry, or another food pantry in the area. We have to look at it from a different perspective. If our church food pantries are stocked from our congregants, then our congregants themselves start to see the issue of hunger in our city. So I'll give you an example. So on Sundays, as we're doing the first collection, right? As we're doing the first collection, the pastor should be able to say, we had 500 cans of ravioli last week, and you know what? They're all gone because our neighbors here are in hunger. Please, by next Sunday, we need to restock 500 cans of soup or 500 cans of ravioli.
Members of the congregation brought to this.
Exactly. So the congregation, just like if I give my son $10 to spend at school, and he blows through all $10 on one day, I'm going to want to know where it went, right? And it's the same thing with the parish. They're going to want to know where it went. How did it go? So they can start getting involved in the process of food insecurity and get involved in the issue of hunger. And I think that's really, if your viewers walk away with anything, it's this sense of detachment from hunger. If 1 in 4 children in our city, in our county, are hungry every single day and they don't know about it, this is a big issue. It's a big issue. It's a detachment from those who are hungry. Do we know our neighbors? Have we talked to our neighbors? Do we know what's going on in our city? And are we getting involved?
Yeah. Many times when you start asking questions, you find out, as you said, right, in your own congregation, there are people who are suffering.
That's right.
Need help.
That's right.
They're not going to ask you. They're not going to tell you. They show up dressed like the person next to them. They don't want to be known as the person in need. But when you start just pricking a little bit, just asking a few questions and diving a little deeper, you find out very easily that it's members of our own church, our own mosque, our own synagogue that has issues and need our support. Yeah, absolutely. Let's pivot for a moment in the time we have left to affordable housing. I know you've done a lot of work in affordable housing with the 3 faith communities. What's the current issue with affordable housing? What's happening?
Well, as it relates to affordable housing, it's not having enough affordable housing.
It's not happening, right?
Yeah, it's if we don't have more developments that are coming up, it limits or it increases the cost of rent. And if the cost of rent, because of a scarcity of supply, and if the cost of rent goes up, well, it prices out people who are only able to afford $1,100 a month because they're on a fixed budget. For example, many of our seniors who live on a fixed income, if the apartment rates continue to rise because of a lack of development in the city of Houston, well, they get priced out of their own neighborhoods. Right? It's a major issue, especially as we have an influx of residents who come into our city.
You know, the affordable housing issue is one that we've been battling here in Houston for years and years. We just don't build enough affordable housing. And we don't build enough affordable housing because it's not an incentive. It's not an incentive to the developer, to the builder for affordable housing. We've tried to come up with some formulas. You build X amount of this kind of housing and that kind of housing in your plan, but it just haven't seemed to work. The coalition has worked on many projects together. How does this issue of social isolation, it keeps coming up? We still have parts of our community that seem to be not only not engaged, hard to engage. We tend to try to work on that, but it seems to me it's a challenge to have that outreach. Well, tell us a little bit some of the things we're going to be doing in outreach.
Well, outreach in terms of affordable housing or in terms of food insecurity?
And just in general, just in trying to reach the people. I know you have done some program. Didn't you have a State of the Unity thing recently in February?
Yeah, we did have a State of the Unity. That's right. But our State of the Unity was about getting Democrats and Republicans together with faith leaders to bridge the differences. Right.
That's why I'm shifting a little bit. I want to use these last 2 minutes to talk about that real quick. Tell us.
Well, how about this? Let's get rid of the political leadership. Let's talk about what people of faith can do. I think in terms of outreach, the major thing that we're facing in our country right now is a lack of communication, especially a lack of communication with people that we disagree with. As people of faith, and I know this isn't a faith-based show, but as a person of faith, and I know, Larry, you're a person of faith as well, or just generally as Houstonians living in the most diverse city in the country, we have to be able to flex our diversity. Otherwise, it just becomes a geographic or social term. It doesn't really mean anything unless we actually do something about it. That means talking to people who don't look like us, talking to people who don't believe like us, and talking to people who are adversely opposed to the same issues that we're rooting for, right? It means crossing the aisle and shaking someone's hand and saying, hey, tell me about how you feel today. Tell me why you feel this way. How can we work together? I think those, in terms of outreach from our leadership and from a neighborly standpoint, that's something that we can absolutely do more of in Houston. And that's a terrific way for us to flex the diversity that we have and change it into plurality.
And you and I and a small group of people will pick up on this at another time when we can dive more deeply into this issue of our unity or lack thereof. I want to thank you for being on Dialogue Houston this week. Our time always goes too quickly. And I thank you for being part of the show this week. I'm going to pivot real quick with a word about Ukraine before we end here. It's about democracy and the rule of law. It's about patriotism, people defending their home and their way of life against a cruel foreign power. Ukrainians' resolve is a great source of strength. We all should take resolve from their source of strength. The odds remain against them. However, they have hope. They have support, globally and growing. They have understanding. They have truth, and they have prayers on their side. So all of us continue. Let's support Ukraine. Let's pray for the Ukrainians. Let's give them hope and support. Let's send them the supplies they need. In a wonderful country like the United States, we should be able to help supply them with everything they need. And then also because this is Houston, and it will happen, and it will be coming. Let's get ready to receive the Ukrainian refugees that will be at our doorstep, probably in the very near future. This is Houston. We can do it. We can take care of them as we've always have with the immigrants who come to our stores and to our doorsteps here in Houston. Let's continue to pray for Ukraine. Let's give them the hope and support they need. But let us all join in unity in that support and hope. As always, we thank you for being part of Dialogue Houston. We look forward to you joining us in future segments. Until then, as always, stay well, be safe, and peace, power, and love.